you let me ask you first of all, what were your thoughts when you heard the Attorney General of the nation decide to sue Georgia because of the voting rights bill?
I was incredibly disappointed, to be honest. Having looked at the bill and also having looked at the lawsuit that DOJ filed, the Assistant Attorney General over the Civil Rights Division right now, she said in that press conference that Georgia's bill was racially motivated.
Yes.
And if you read that lawsuit DOJ filed, I want to say half of that lawsuit is all about the history of discrimination in Georgia. It's all about voting population. I mean, it has nothing to do with the actual provisions of the new Georgia law. And if you look at the provisions, especially if you look at the provisions of the new Georgia law compared with the law in other states, and frankly in other blue states like New York or Delaware or Colorado, a lot of the provisions that Georgia put in their law makes it easier to vote.
There's no doubt about it.
Makes it easier to vote. And that's what I can't understand is why Merrick Garland, the new Attorney General of the United States, would allow himself to get involved in this political process and come down on Georgia in frankly a political way.
It must make a lot of people who have a background in law say, well, maybe thank God he wasn't appointed Supreme Court
Yeah,
justice.
and with all the decisions coming out of the Supreme Court right now, I would be in that camp.
Here's what he said.
Today, the Department of Justice is suing the state of Georgia. Our complaint alleges that recent changes to Georgia's election laws were enacted with the purpose of denying or abridging the right of black Georgians to vote on account of their race or color in violation of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act.
You know, Mike, what really got me a bit, not being an attorney, this one resonated with me like it would if there are 50 headlines, that ought to be number one in the amount of damage done to the integrity of government in Washington, if there were any bits left. It's so flagrant that they are now using the Department of Justice as a tool of the Democrat Party.
Yeah, and it's not even hidden anymore, exactly what you said.
It's not. When someone who's a non-lawyer can look at this and say, boy, that's crazy.
Right. I mean, one example I'll give you is, Delaware, the home state of our president, has never allowed early voting. Never. Mm-hmm. Next year will be the first time ever that Delaware will allow early voting. And here, Georgia expanded the days allowing early voting. So how do you not go after Delaware for not allowing early voting, but now you're going after Georgia for all these provisions?
I think because they get away with this, because they've got the news media behind them, they get away with these unbelievable statements of that have no facts at all. For instance, when you start talking about you can't bring anybody water, or these poor people need water or food when they're in line, you can still bring them all. You could feed them a buffet, but
right.
They have to be 150 feet
150 feet away. That's correct. And poll workers can allow them water. I mean, they can put out water, unattended receptacles of
That's
water.
right.
It's all there. Yeah. So this fallacy about not allowing food and water, which the president himself has continued this fallacy, is really, it's sad in our country.
It is sad, and the only reason they do this is because we have dumbed down the American people to a point where they know they got a chance for them to believe this, and indoctrination has been successful.
Yeah, and if you look at the past, and when I was a federal prosecutor, we had allegations of voter fraud. I personally saw allegations of absentee ballot fraud throughout our state. I know Lieutenant Governor Hoseman, when he was Secretary of State, did studies about the fraud in the absentee ballot across the state. But if you look at what they've done in Georgia, here's what it all comes down to. They've made it easier to vote in Georgia and harder to cheat by requiring more voter ID for absentee ballots, by putting these limits on just the runaway election that they had last year. I mean, I understand why they loosened a lot of the restrictions on elections last year, because we had COVID. We had a once-in-a-lifetime, 100-year event. And now what Georgia has done has come back, like the ballot boxes. They had never had ballot boxes throughout, various counties in Georgia. And what the legislature and the governor in Georgia have done, they've come back and codified what was just a temporary rule. They've come back and codified these ballot boxes and made it so ballot boxes are mandatory in every single 159 counties throughout Georgia. How is that limiting the right to vote?
It is amazing to me also when you look at this, a lot of it is to make sure you kill the king. And the king right now, as far as the Republican Party, is still Donald Trump. And they're going after him in a multi-faceted of ways. But all of them saying, how dare he even say that there was any or impropriety in the election? And this is kind of funny because one of the headlines on Fox this morning is the New York City Board of Elections yesterday or Tuesday, which was, by the way, yesterday. I don't want to go through that again, faced swift backlash over an error that resulted in 135,000 pre-election test votes being counted because they were not properly purged from the system.
Oh.
Now they're saying that this is a problem in New York, but it couldn't happen nationwide during the presidential election?
That's incredible.
It's insane.
That's incredible. Yeah, I don't know what to say except to my Democratic friends, and I have Democratic friends, you've got to refocus on what you believe in and your principles and not make it personal to one individual who is the former president of the United States.
It's almost like centrifugal force is spinning us out of common sense control, and you wonder what it's going to take to get us back.
Yeah, I think it's going to take leaders. I think it's going to take statesmen. I think that's what our country needs right now, and that's what our country is just frankly longing for. And I see some in our local elections, in our local politicians, our state politicians. You see some emerging throughout the country, and I hope they step up and run for national elections.
I got one ceasefire text this morning we were talking about earlier, the police officers and their training. And I think in highway patrolman it takes a lot longer, almost twice as long to become a highway patrolman than a police officer.
I don't know the answer to that.
I don't either,
yeah.
So I didn't know if you would know the answer to that. I didn't know if their training was the same. I don't think so. I think it's harder to become a highway patrol officer than a police officer or a sheriff or rather a deputy. But anyway, what's your thoughts on this? Your thoughts on an attainable solution, something that local governments ought to be looking at to train their officers to control violence? What are the things legally they could do that maybe they're not doing? Yeah,
one thing I think is, to your point, is increased training. Our law enforcement gets a lot of training when they go through the Mississippi Law Enforcement Officers Training Academy. But what they could do, and we did this in the U.S. Attorney's Office, we would have trainings throughout the year where we'd go in and we would train about probable cause, about search warrants, about the law. And I think officers need that, but they also need training on, you hear this a lot, on de-escalation. And I know a lot of them, they go in with that intent, but as you and I, Paul, we're human beings just like our police officers are. And when they get in that situation where they've got to make a less than a second decision on something that's about to either endanger their own lives or endanger the lives of others, we've got to make sure they're trained before they get in those situations. I was at the FBI Training Academy in Quantico a couple of years ago as U.S. Attorney, and we did this simulator with a simulated firearm and a scenario that was kind of a virtual reality situation. Mm-hmm. And Paul, when you're in that situation where someone comes through that door and you don't know whether they're an intruder or they're an innocent bystander and they pull a knife on you or a gun on you or whatever, it's incredible to be in that situation. And I think a lot of us laypersons, a lot of us who aren't carrying those firearms, don't have the badge and helping protect others, I think it's hard for us to comprehend what our men and women in law enforcement are going through. We'll talk more about it. What is the uniformity state to state, and some other questions for Mike Hurst off the air. And I gave you this quote, and I'm not sure exactly what it was. I think it was 40 to 43% of the Asheville, North Carolina Police Department's gone through either retirements or just, I've had it. That's it. I quit. And Asheville, North Carolina is not the place you think that would happen. No, and I can tell you, if that has happened, then they're in the same boat as Jackson, Mississippi. Yep. Because a commission study about 20 years ago said Jackson should have about 608 police officers. Mm-hmm. Paul, we're down to less than 300 police officers in Jackson, Mississippi. 160,000 individuals. Realistically, if you get your car stolen, even if it happens to be a shooting, your chance of having a full-fledged investigation is Yeah, I think with the proliferation of murders and the proliferation of violent crime, I think they have to focus their time on that and less on property crime. And that's a result of just fewer men and women on the police force. And the infuriating thing is I push them and push them and push them to try to allow the Department of Justice to send more federal agents to Jackson to help, and they just rebuffed us on every occasion.
Yeah, the Trump administration, of course, this is even before the snubbing from the mayor at the opening of the museums. But the Trump administration was willing to do that.
It was all partisan for the mayor. He viewed me as a Trump appointee. He viewed me as someone who was a Republican in law enforcement, despite the fact that almost everything I did as U.S. attorney focused on the city of Jackson, focused on making it better. Paul, this is our capital city. These men and women who live in Jackson are brothers and sisters in my faith in Christ. And my wife busts her tail to help individuals for the last 15, 20 years since we've been back home through her ministry in Jackson. This is where we work. This is where our friends and family live, and we're in it for the long haul.
I understand that, but in reality, when you put that before the population who votes in Jackson, and they put the guy in by a large margin,
Jackson will never change until it has real leadership.
Yeah. They've got to be.
The bottom line.
I just think people who are voting there have to ask more out of their leaders.
One example, in the last number of months, there have been grant proposals coming down from the Department of Justice that cities can apply to hire more police officers, where the federal government will pay something like 75-80% of new police officers. There have been crickets from the city of Jackson.
Even in this administration?
Even in this administration.
I'm talking about the current administration in Washington. Really?
Yes.
Well, that's crazy.
It is absolutely insane. And this the Gallup did a poll about 6 months ago, back in August, of who wants or who needs police officers. 80% of African Americans said we want the same level or more police officers in our communities. Because at the end of the day, especially in our capital city, which is made up, I think, of 80% African American population, the ones who are penalized, the ones who suffer because of a degradation in our police departments or a defund the police from the Democratic mantra is our African American brothers and sisters.
It kind of mirrors the same thing. It's up to upper 70s, mid to upper 70s to near 80% of African Americans have no problems with voter ID. But you don't hear that mantra on TV or from some of the Democrat leaders.
Well, and especially when you look at like the law in our state and even the law in Georgia, it's not just a driver's license. It can be a utility bill. It could be any type of document from the government or from a private business that has your name and address on it. So it's not it's harder. It's harder to go get your ticket at will call for Mississippi State versus Vanderbilt than it is to vote.
It's harder to do anything. I mean, it's a lot of examples you could use out there. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, it's incredible.
But that's the way it is, and it won't change until people change and they become more politically aware and understand the consequences or something that's going to they're going to suffer the consequences. And
I am hopeful for Jackson because these mothers, these fathers who are seeing their kids murdered, these groups who are advocating for victims in Jackson, if you put together a victim group in Jackson, it would be more powerful and have a bigger voice than any other type of group in the city of Jackson. And that's what we need.
Well, if you want people to stay in your city, whether it's businesses or individuals to help you pay taxes, crime is number one.
Absolutely. Safety and security of our people is number one. And that's the number one job of government. I mean, that's one of the, if not the main reason we have come together as a people and formed a government is to protect each other.
You made any decisions on the next office there? Or just...
Paul, I've got 6 kids at home, or not at home. I got 6 kids, 3 in college, 5 girls, which means probably 5 weddings. So I've got a lot of college funds, a lot of wedding funds to get in order.
You poor guy. Mike's always good.